Good morning and welcome to another session of RBC Disruptors. This is our monthly conversation about disruption, innovation, and how technology is changing everything around us. I'm John Stackhouse. It's my pleasure to host these conversations. If you're joining us by WebEx or Facebook, welcome. Please join the conversations. Share your questions, and our panelists will get to them in the conversation. For those of you here with us at Water Park Place, please share your questions and comments on Facebook Live. Today, we're talking about cryptocurrency. And before I introduce our guests, I want to kick off with an excerpt from a letter, which probably many of you read. This was a letter to Jamie Dimon from Adam Lutwin, who's the CEO of a company called Chain. And he was responding to Jamie Dimon's skepticism, to put it politely, about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. And I thought this might help set the stage and the tone for the conversation. So Adam wrote, "Let me start by stating that I believe the market for cryptocurrencies is overheated and irrationally exuberant. There are a lot of posers creating them and some scammers too. There's a lot of conflicts of interest, self-serving hype, and obfuscation. Very few people in the media understand what's going on. Very few people in finance understand what's going on. Very few people in technology understand what's going on. Very few people in academia or government understand what's going on. Very few people buying cryptocurrencies understand what's going on. And it's very possible I don't understand what's going on." So I think on that last point, he's entirely right. If I can speak for myself and maybe for some people in the audience. We've got three terrific people here to help us understand a bit of what's going on. I'll introduce you and ask you each to just share a bit about what you're up to today, starting with Matthew Spoke, who's the CEO of Nuco, although you've changed your name and a bit of your mission. Let you, Matthew, explain to us in 30 seconds what you're up to.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, my name is Matthew Spoke. I'm the founder of a project we've been developing for the last few years called Aeon. We're developing a nonprofit, essentially software foundation focused on scaling infrastructure in the public and private blockchain space. So we'll talk more.
Great.
about
We'll get into that. Hilary, welcome. Hilary Carter, Director of Research at the Blockchain Research Institute here in Toronto. Tell us a bit about BRI.
Thanks, John. Great to be here. At Blockchain Research Institute, we're a multi-million-dollar think tank, and we are conducting the definitive investigation into blockchain applications, strategies, and use cases across a dozen different industries, exploring how this technology will transform organizations and change old business models.
Great. Christian Lassonde, you probably recognize him from a whole range of forums, including BNN appearances. Christian runs something called Impression Ventures. That's all right. Impression Ventures, he's the founder and managing partner.
Thanks, yeah. So Impression Ventures is a venture capital firm, and our focus is exclusively on companies disrupting financial services. We've invested in companies in the wealth tech space. We've invested in companies in insurtech, payments, all across sectors, and we've certainly spent a lot of time over the last couple of years investigating the crypto space, given its potential impact on financial services.
Great.
And I'll just say one last thing, which is I'm definitely a cynical optimist, so as most VCs probably are.
We've got a good range of opinions on stage, so we'll have some pretty heated discussion and debate. Let's start with some snappers, just to get to know you a bit. Going to kick off with a question about your worst investment or online purchase to date.
Worst investment or online there are definitely a few cryptocurrencies that I should have stayed away from over the course of the last few years. This market has proven that not everything goes up, if I can say that. But yeah, definitely, I'd say worst investments made in the cryptocurrency space.
A lesson in gravity. Hilary.
I made a penny stock purchase of a tech company in the late 90s, and my folly was not to sell it when it went up on absolutely no grounds. And didn't even get my cost out. So the company itself grew. I didn't sell, and then it went back to basically nothing. So it was a lesson learned.
Christian.
I've got a great one. A very early investment of mine in Novell in 1992. So great point. This is right before the internet really took off, and they were big believers in the IPX network, which of course was a competitor to the IP network, and that didn't work out so well for me. Right. But I learned a lot from it.
What did you learn?
You know what? That disruption comes in all shapes and sizes, and really to be looking out into the future as to what other potential competitors are doing.
Great. Let's get into cryptocurrency. And Matt, maybe you can help set the table here with a bit of definition. A lot of hype we saw in the video. Lots of hype, different differences of opinion, and a lot of differences of definition. So help the audience understand what is cryptocurrency in your mind.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges is that it's very difficult to define it as a single thing. I think it's a new mechanism to create fungible value that can be attached to any number of things. And so you look across the spectrum of cryptocurrencies. I mean, if you focus on this market, you realize there are thousands of them out there, probably 99% of them being less than all that relevant. But there are definitely different mechanisms to now create value that can be traded, and that value might be representative of some different underlying asset or no underlying asset. But it's the idea of frictionless movement of value.
But Hilary, we were talking off stage about how her mother has become a crypto grandma. How do you define cryptocurrency for her, since you've got her invested in it?
Yeah, I would say investment is a generous way to describe it. Really experimentation by holding a small amount, no more than $50, for example, simply for the purpose of having a hands-on learning experience. To understand this technology is to have a hands-on experience with it, to explore how the currency changes hands, to take a look at the architecture of how Bitcoin operates, to watch price fluctuations on your phone. I think that's a tremendous learning experience. And so I wanted both my mother to explore that as well as my children to understand a little bit about what I do. We can have some conversations in a meaningful way.
And what problem are we trying to solve with this?
The problem we're trying to solve is creating a mechanism for value transfer that does not require an intermediary. That is the purpose of cryptocurrencies. Truly decentralized money enables individuals to transfer value without an established intermediary to serve as a trusted party. And it's an incredibly efficient mechanism, though it has a long way to go.
But the current system is not terribly broken, probably in a lot of people's minds. So why try to fix it?
It's not terribly broken, but it doesn't serve 2.5 billion people who are not part of our global financial system. Our system, there is a lot of friction in financial services. We cannot pay our US dollar vendors with a check, a US dollar denominated check drawn on a Canadian bank. Email money transfers within Canada, that's great. But if we're trying to make international payments, that's really problematic. Creates a lot of friction in global supply chains, for example.
Right, we'll come back to that. Christian, you talked about hype cycles a little bit before. Wonder if you can share some insight on this hype cycle. What's fueling this? Even just in the last 12 months, this has shown all the signs of cycles we've talked about for decades past.
You know, with the caveat that I may not know what I'm talking about. Given
okay, I think we've established no one does.
no one does. Look, I think the number one fuel for the rocket fuel for this is greed. You know, greed is the very typical fuel for any bubble and any asset bubble. But I think there's also, I think that's one. I think the second level is, you know, there's a lot of jargon being thrown around. And I think a lot of people who think they understand what that jargon means, and I think, you know, the crypto space has done a really amazing job, for good or bad, to you know, surround itself with, you know, all sorts of words like distributed and federated and et cetera, et cetera. Like they layer on these terms, and it gives a mysticism to the space that is actually undeserved. Because really, when you boil down a lot of what's going on, is you have, you know, the distributed ledger. Oh, well, that sounds really sexy, but if I explain it as a really, really slow, really, really expensive database, not so sexy. And so I think a lot of that jargon is also fueling a lot of the speculative behavior we're seeing.
You know, it's important what you say about the slowness, and there's a lot of friction in blockchain. And I want to come back to Matthew and Hilary on this, because as people invest more in it, they're discovering this is not necessarily something that moves at the speed of light. So it's got its own frictions while it's trying to address the frictions in the incumbent system. How quickly is that going to go away, Hilary?
I see the industry working diligently to try to solve the scalability of blockchain architecture. And I think, to be fair, when the internet launched, Netflix would not have been able to run on the internet of the mid to early 90s. Completely impossible. developments had to be made in order to service internet-based applications. And that's sort of where we are in terms of blockchain architecture. We are using beta-grade architecture right now, and everybody knows that we've got a lot of work to do before the technology can be scaled and solve problems.
Can I counter that one?
Yeah.
Because the underlying protocol for the internet, the IP and UDP and TCP have not changed. Like, these are literally protocols that were designed in the 70s, if not earlier, that Netflix runs on. So what changed between now and then is fiber optic cables, is the hardware that the stuff runs on. So to argue that the protocols of blockchain today are not where they need to be, or is that analogous to the IP? I don't believe that for a second. IP actually has had its killer app within 3 years of its launch, which was email. It's 10 years later from blockchain. We still haven't seen the killer app.
Unless you believe that Bitcoin is the killer app.
Yeah.
And I think
so,
that's
so
what
Matt,
a lot of people would refute.
defend that, is it?
I think, well, I mean, to be fair, there's layers and layers of infrastructure that need to get built for any new system. That's the stage we're at. I think the hype results from the fact that people are over-promising on infrastructure that's not quite, ready to meet those promises. But underneath this hype trend, if you lay two graphs one on top of the other, you'll probably see that there's fundamental innovation and fundamental development happening that's just buried underneath a mountain of speculation. And that doesn't mean that the fundamentals aren't growing in the right direction. It just means that we can't see it because we're all blinded by the crazy volatile markets that sit on top of that fundamental innovation. I think to your point, fiber optic cables is a great analogy for some infrastructure that has yet to be built in the crypto space. There are people working on better hardware and better virtual machine designs and faster processing of transactions. These are layers of infrastructure that have to be built to make this more feasible.
So I don't doubt that there's a lot of innovation going on, a lot of important innovation going on. How is Bitcoin the killer app?
Well, I'd say, scrape everything away. Right now, you try to use Bitcoin as an alternative to any payment system. I'd say in most countries around the world, it's a less efficient way to do it. And that might be true for the next 10 years. It might be true it might be always true. Bitcoin may always be less efficient. The problem we're fundamentally trying to address as an industry is the problem of trust, is the problem of why should we place all of this centralized trust into the hands of a very small number of companies around the world, not just in financial services, but in internet infrastructure in general. With the promises of the early internet was to create a decentralized communication protocol that very quickly became a very centralized communication protocol that leads to the Facebook and Cambridge Analytica scandals that we're dealing with today in the media, right? So we see this as significantly more fundamental than just a new mechanism for payment. We see this as re-architecting how do we build accessible and fair and open systems that don't end up being controlled by a very, very small number of companies around the world.
So what's wrong with centralization? Because it seems that the general population is pretty comfortable with that. We've accepted Facebook, for example, as a centralizing force. We're okay with that.
Yeah, and I think, Christian, I think we were arguing about this on the phone last week when we were talking about this. Centralization has led to efficiency, and I think in most people's lives, they're willing to make that trade-off. They're willing to say, I'll give you my data because you provide me a service that's extremely efficient, and unless there's a equivalently efficient service that's
Same with money.
Same with money.
And can I just interject?
Sure.
Actually, I thought a little bit more about it since our conversation on Friday. And I think we're also discounting the cost of behavior change, right? In other words, I think something as a VC that we think a lot about whenever we're investing in a company is, will the product service the company's bringing, does it require behavioral change within the audience that they're serving? And if it does, the hurdle becomes much higher for investment. Why? Because people don't change. And when they do change, it requires a massive amount of effort. So we do so a great example of change that we have seen is the introduction of the iPhone and the use of smartphones. Before that, people didn't do anywhere near as much stuff as they did on the smartphone, or the smartphones didn't exist. But that change required a massive amount of effort by a single actor working in a very coordinated and concentrated effort, spending billions. That was Apple. My view, that one of the biggest challenges of the distributed space is, can you have that sustained, concentrated, and coordinated effort in a system that actually is very much designed against that? And I think that to me is a big doubt that I have about the long-term viability of the space.
Although the smartphone benefited extremely significantly from compression technology and cloud computing. That allowed us to share photos and video, which changed everything.
And that was part of the coordinated, concentrated effort by a single actor working in unison to make a behavioral change.
So isn't that going to happen in blockchain?
If I was a betting man, and I guess I am, I would bet no.
Right. Let's get back to the centralization debate and what the benefit is to the consumer, because I'm hearing from Matt and Hilary that this is an interesting but kind of fringe experiment, and I'm wondering when it's going to go mainstream in finance. Hilary.
Mainstream in finance. That's an excellent question, John, and I don't have a perfect answer for that. It may go mainstream in underserved regions where they simply don't have access to financial services, or where centralized money has become so devalued that ordinary people have lost faith in their governments to provide economic stability. If the technology creates platforms and services and protocols that add value and incentivize behavior, then we will see behavior change and migration. Ultimately, human behavior is motivated by, is incentive driven. And so much of blockchain architecture is based on incentive mechanisms. That's embedded. And if we witness a migration from centralized social media applications like Facebook to a decentralized social media application whereby individuals have a brand new incentive that never existed before, where they can monetize the data that they generate, where they can enjoy new levels of privacy that have previously been unattainable in the digital economy, that's a paradigm shift. And I think if Facebook and other centralized tools are giving us a disincentive by way of excessive surveillance and data breaches, and new technology and new applications are providing us with brand new incentives, including the opportunities to monetize our own data, I think that we will see a transition of human behavior. Where there is value, we'll see migration.
So much of this comes back to, you mentioned this earlier, to trust. And I sense that a lot of what you're talking about is in reference to low trust societies or segments of society, and that's fine. But in the main, certainly in the mainstream of the world, everything is built on high trust. So our democracy, our financial system are all built on trust, and it's kind of working with some problems as you've identified. Matthew, I'm wondering if fundamentally that is the epic challenge for you, that you're essentially trying to encourage people to distrust the system and move away from it, and to move into a more anarchic or libertarian space, when what we've got built for us is in fact working fairly well because it's rooted in trust.
Yeah, and I think, to add a little bit of cynicism myself, I think, I don't think everybody in the crypto space believes that this is going to completely flip the power orders of the world. This could forever exist as a parallel system. It may not replace the existing system, and it may exist as a niche parallel system. I do think that there is appetite for that parallel system. How big that appetite is has yet to be determined. Whether it takes over mainstream, kind of the mind share of the mainstream, we'll see. One thing that again, to the terminology we've kind of coined in the cryptocurrency communities, we don't talk about trust or no trust. We talk about the having no need to trust, right? So we use the term trustlessness, which is a mouthful when you talk about it, but it's essentially building a system where you don't need to have trust in the counterparty. You don't need to have trust in the person you're interacting with. You just simply understand that the architecture and economics of the system are such that it acts in the way you think it will act, in the way it's intended to act. Meaning you take trust out of the equation rather than introducing this concept of should I trust you or should I not trust you? Because that's where you get caught in these situations where you, in some cases, put your trust in the wrong place.
So you mentioned parallel systems, and there's always been an interest, certainly in finance. There are certain people who would love to have a parallel system. It's how money laundering and fraud works through parallel systems, and that leads to a question we've got from Facebook. How do we combat crypto being used for money laundering and terror financing and the like?
Well, I mean, I think the unfortunate answer is you can't. I mean, this is a technology, the cat is out of the bag, right? So this is a technology where now we have to start thinking about tools in which we can start to identify trends and tools in which we can start to pattern recognize on top of these systems. There is no such thing as going backwards and saying, well, how do I make it impossible for money launderers to use Bitcoin? it's a nonsensical debate, right? So, and this is the same thing that, with every new technology has come goods and bads, and you just hope that over time the goods outweigh the bads. And I think this is a perfect example of that. And, in some contexts, money laundering or terrorist financing or tax evasion. In other contexts, to Hilary's point around different economies around the world with less stable governments, these might actually be positive things where hiding your money from your government is necessary, and paying taxes into a corrupt autocratic system is necessary. So as much as there is bads in established economies like Canada, there comes the goods in places around the world where you might find yourself a money launderer, and if you lived in certain places around the world where you didn't want people to know how you're gaining wealth.
So Hilary,
can I interject there?
Yeah.
Because I actually think that money laundering, nation states bypassing sanctions using cryptocurrencies is actually probably the single biggest threat to the crypto assets in the G7 countries from the standpoint of we've had this pattern in the past with laws around peer-to-peer networks for music file transfers, right? The legal system went after them, and I think that we may see a change of laws here in the next 5+ years, where the ownership of cryptos becomes illegal, and so there's very effective tools from centralized states to crush this stuff. And I think if the space as a whole doesn't confront this problem head on, they may just be crushed by the law.
so that's a great provocative point to turn to Hilary, because you're working with a number of governments. The Blockchain Research Institute is working with the federal, provincial, and City of Toronto to help think through, but even apply some of this technology. So as you're talking to public officials and to regulators, how are you helping them think about this challenge? They probably don't want to be party to money laundering.
Yeah, absolutely not. Well, the framework that we focus on is blockchain technology, blockchain as an architecture that will underpin the other technologies of the fourth industrial revolution, to be a transactional platform to store data points collected from connected devices, and possibly artificial intelligence and autonomous vehicles. All those kinds of things all that data can be captured on an immutable ledger. So we focus more on blockchain technology than we do cryptocurrency and international payments and transfers, though they are all related. I see tremendous interest from the Canadian government at multiple levels to become active participants in learning how the technology can be applied to solve specific problems, how it can streamline payments processing internally, how there can be greater levels of transparency, because one of the features of blockchain technology is transparency and immutability. And imagine our...
Can you explain what you mean by immutability?
Yeah, the permanency of records on blockchain ledgers. You cannot delete transactions on a blockchain. They're there forever. So it's a permanent verification that a transfer happened. Whether that transfer was a piece of information or whether that transfer was an actual unit of value, some kind of payment. One of the applications that we have studied is a voting application using blockchain. So yes, it's a type of cryptocurrency, but it's not a payment. It is a different type of asset class, where votes are a new asset, our private data is a new asset, our health records could be new assets. And we see the province of Ontario very interested in applying blockchain technology to citizen identity. Can we streamline citizen services? Can we add value to Canadians? Can we increase the level of transparency and raise the level of trust in our government? Can we have higher levels of legitimacy? So that's the framework through which our government officials are exploring blockchain as the technology, far beyond cryptocurrencies as payment mechanisms.
So does that suggest that most progress is likely to be in the non-finance, in the non-currency space?
Given the government's interest in non-payment applications, I think we will have favorable regulation that supports the development of different types of asset classes using blockchain, not necessarily payment mechanisms.
Christian, you've already sort of self-proclaimed as a skeptic on this, and you probably have deals coming to you every day, or pitches.
Yes.
Is there what in those pitches catches your eye? What's of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's one area that we think is interesting, which is in the sovereignty of data. I think one of the aspects that's really misunderstood about blockchain and Bitcoin is the expense. So we have all these benefits. What are the cons? And so speed is one of the cons. We've touched on that. But one of the other big cons is actually the cost. If you compare sort of the cost of storing a byte of data on AWS as a sort of proxy for what is a cloud storage data cost, and you compare that to sort of Ether or Bitcoin, there's about 1 million times price difference between the cost of storage. So, in some instances, that cost storage is worth it. The benefits far outweigh that million-time increase. The vast majority of cases actually really doesn't. And you look at a solution and go, okay, you know what? To store data, there's easier ways, less expensive ways to store data. But nation state where two nations need to share a data set, but neither wants to have sovereignty over that. The other one to have sovereignty over that data. It's kind of an interesting space. Very hard to invest in government-related projects, given you're dealing with government procurement. So we're probably not going to make an investment in that space anytime soon. But that's one area where genuinely it's interesting. For the most part, we see a lot of payment providers, payment mechanisms. There's like 400 plus out there today, and to make a bet on any one is actually probably, I might as well just go buy a lottery ticket. Probably have better luck doing that.
Or Bitcoin.
Probably have better luck buying a lottery ticket. So I wish I had more insightful, but part of it is also I think the space needs to mature and needs to move away from here's a really cool technology, let's go find an application for it, to okay, we have a really interesting application. We have a really interesting opportunity set. We've got an amazing team around it. Oh, and by the way, we just happen to use this set of technologies.
So,
speaking of the lottery, if I may, our regulatory environment allows us to freely implode using gambling mechanisms today, and yet we are restricted on buying other types of assets like cryptocurrencies. So it's an interesting question.
What do you mean by
contemplate.
freely implode?
Well,
as individuals?
Yeah, as individuals, we can go down to the casino.
I can spend my life savings on lottery tickets.
And it happens. And
But you can also buy crypto.
Yeah.
It's more restrictive to buy crypto if you're going to abide by the law. That the OSC said you need to be an accredited investor, and if not, you can only buy $2,500 in
to buy a
cryptocurrencies.
token. To buy a new token. That's categorized as a security. Right, that's where a token, where somebody's taken, carved off a part of their business and have said this is going to be both the payment mechanism for my business, but it's also going to be a part of the ownership of my business. And so, of course, security regulators worldwide have said, look, if that ownership unit acts like a security, then it's going to be regulated like a security, and that's where the accredited investor laws come in.
Yeah. So gambling, almost every society has to wrestle with this because it's part of human nature. Most governments choose to box it and regulate it, or at least police it, knowing that humans are going to waste a chunk of their savings, hopefully not too much, on that activity. And I wonder if that's where Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is going. It sounds like it from some of this conversation, into that kind of speculative / entertainment box that governments will tolerate because it feeds a certain part of human nature. Christian, you called it greed, but it won't be allowed to seep into the mainstream. Matthew and Hilary, as you talk to regulators and government officials, are they thinking more ambitiously than that?
I don't know if it was on the list that Adam Ludwin sent to Jamie Dimon, but I think if anybody understands this least, it's governments, it's policymakers and regulators around the world. And I think there's a fundamental challenge that governments will be faced in this space, and it's a regulatory challenge around enforcement. In some contexts, the rules that they would like to enforce might be impossible to enforce in this environment because of what this is. Governments, if you go macro and you say, well, what happens if crypto really does become mainstream? You look at the three mechanisms through which governments control levers of the economy and essentially fund their existence. They do it through taxation, they do it through inflation, and they do it through debt. All three of those things start to dissipate if this becomes mainstream technology. Because taxation in Bitcoin is very difficult to enforce, if not impossible, identifying who the actors and participants are in these systems, other than voluntarily asking people to please self-disclose that you own this currency.
And you don't buy the tech argument that Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies can be developed with taxation?
Absolutely, they could, but there'll always be that parallel system. You could build the government's blockchain, and you can say, hey, to all you law-abiding citizens, please use the Central Bank of Canada's blockchain. But that's not going to
That's a
take away
contradiction,
this is not going to take away the transaction flow that happens increasingly will continue to happen on top of networks like Bitcoin. You know, the model of like monetary policy using inflationary policy, you know, Bitcoin is the complete opposite. It's a deflationary currency that, you know, essentially gives people an alternative to, you know, where you used to say, well, because if I just stick my money under my mattress, I know it's going to lose 2% a year in value, so I might go invest that in a government bond, and that's how I get kind of value off of my money. And now I'm feeding into the government debt machine. Now you've got deflationary currencies that give you an alternative to that. So, you know, we're so niche today, it's difficult to think, you know, at this macro level long term. It may never get there. But if it does get there, this is what causes concerns in large governments like China, where they've, you know, and Christian mentioned earlier that they can be very effective at crushing new innovations. I'd argue that China's a great example of attempting to slow down the Bitcoin economy and failing. It used to be that the Chinese government would step out and say, hey, Bitcoin is now banned in China, and the price of Bitcoin would plummet 40–50% as a result. The last time they announced Bitcoin was banned in China, the price of Bitcoin, you know, barely saw a little dip, and it was back 2 days later, because the levers that these regulators and governments control don't apply to this economy. And it must be frustrating. I can imagine that it's frustrating. And it's not to say that that's a good thing. It's just to say that might be the reality of this development.
Right. I think Hilary's champing at the bit to jump in on
I would
this.
say that China has been openly hostile to certain aspects of cryptocurrencies, particularly as payment mechanisms. On the other hand, in September, the Belt and Road Blockchain Consortium was launched, connecting 65 different economies from China to the Mediterranean, the old Silk Road. We now have a blockchain-based architecture, and the Belt and Road Blockchain Initiative has been etched into the Constitution of China. And I'm not aware of any other government who has brought about infrastructure into its constitution. So on one hand, China's very threatened by cryptocurrencies. On the other hand, it's investing heavily into the underlying technology, how to streamline trade, how to build trade infrastructure that will be truly revolutionary down the road.
So long as they control the central
bank, which
defeats the purpose. And that's where I think we run into an irony.
But then we've got open systems versus closed systems.
Christian, you were going to...
No, that was the point I was going to make. China didn't ban the Bitcoin. They just want to control payment mechanisms. They want to control monetary...
Well, they're talking about a digital renminbi on a blockchain, so long as they can decide the monetary supply and decide who the on-ramps are. And
so, I mean, it's folly, really, when you think about, you know, we're going to take this...
That's when you go back to just
system and
build a centralized
system. Frankly, it'd be better to just build it on a sort of modern architecture, web architecture, be cheaper, faster, better.
Let's talk a bit about whether there's a unique Canadian approach to building cryptocurrencies or blockchain more generally, and perhaps regulating it. We're good at a number of things, including finance and regulation in this country. Maybe those are liabilities in terms of the innovation space. But I'll start with Matthew and Hilary. Do you see anything uniquely Canadian as an advantage in this space? I mean, Ethereum was arguably created here, and then it left, and chased out perhaps. So are we, in fact, creating limitations or opportunities here?
I mean, I think we've got, you know, one of the world-leading pools of talent in or around the Toronto area, and anybody who invests in technology would agree with that. I think what we're lacking is an environment that encourages, you know, outside-of-the-box thinking. You know, Christian can probably speak more authoritatively on this than I can, but when I look at the Canadian fintech world, I look at companies who aspire to sell to banks, not compete with banks. And this, you know, this might be the wrong forum to talk about this at RBC. But there's a mindset that doesn't exist in Canada, not only among our entrepreneurs, but among our government regulators, where protection of our incumbent industries is first and foremost. And everything that is considered innovation in this country is to support those incumbent industries, not to challenge them.
I can tell you right. So as the only independent, which means we don't have any bank money in our fund, we see fintechs that are absolutely not just trying to sell to banks. You know, in fact, we see companies that are very much going after profit line items at banks, and so they're out there. We have an unbelievable number of Canadian fintech founders that are starting unbelievable businesses. You know, I think I also have the opportunity to spend some time with the regulators, and I would say our regulators are just as open as any other G7 regulators at this point. In fact, I'd say they're spending a lot of time together talking, because I think they all want to get it right. as right as they can, and both protect consumers, because that is one of their missions, and also keep the financial system stable, because the last thing we want collectively in the world is a massive recession, global recession driven by a massive deflation in crypto assets, for example. So I don't think anyone wants that.
But and this here's a hypothetical. I'd imagine that the next recession is not going to be as a result of cryptocurrencies. I think it's going to be as a result of poor government management. And I think cryptocurrencies may actually see a significant step into the mainstream if we see another 2008 come around the corner.
When you hear about retail investors mortgaging their house, taking the mortgage proceeds to investing in cryptocurrencies, you can see a very rapid escalation. If you see those cryptocurrency values go down, they're now suddenly underwater on their house. They can't make their payments. They lose their house. They lose their jobs. It can quickly escalate. We saw it back in the 2008 financial crisis. And it would be ironic if cryptocurrencies caused the next financial crisis, given that a lot of the genesis of this crypto stuff came out of out of this hatred for banks out of the 2008 financial crisis.
But do you see it ever being pervasive enough to pose a systemic risk?
I don't think we're there yet, but I certainly hear of stories that make me the hair on the back of my neck go up about people doing really irresponsible things with their money in crypto, and so I don't think we're there yet. Hopefully, this decrease in value since December to today has taken a little bit of wind out of the sails. I'd love if, frankly, as a third party, I'd love if the value just sort of stays where it is today and sort of stabilizes, and a little bit of the wind comes out of the air comes out of the bubble. But yeah, I think there's a non-zero risk of a financial collapse based on crypto.
Hilary, can I come back to you on the Canadian advantage or liability question? As you survey the world and see what other governments or jurisdictions are doing, is there a limit to Canada's innovation in this space, or an opportunity?
Canada has so much going for it in terms of being an innovation economy. We have highly livable cities. We have good government, responsible government. We have a highly educated population, and we embrace diversity, especially in the city of Toronto, where 50% of the people in this city came from elsewhere. And we're able to get right down to the business of innovating and benefit from academic institutions, University of Waterloo, that corridor between Toronto and Waterloo, taking advantage of great innovation in quantum computing, in artificial intelligence. We are a rich region for creating an innovation economy. And I think the number one threat to that really thriving is overly restrictive regulation. If we take a chainsaw to this regulation, we will just simply see a brain drain and the foundation dismantled.
But Christian raised the point earlier that this is something that the G7 could, or others could just drop the hammer on. Do you think that's a possibility or likelihood?
There are more than 7 countries in the world, and all these others are looking.
But the 7 countries that essentially run the global
I agree,
financial
but I say that jokingly. Like, you want to know where crypto companies are going today? They're not G7 countries. They're Gibraltar. They're the Caymans. They're Switzerland. They're Barbados. And the regulatory arbitrage is increasingly prevalent in this market, right? And you can build software companies from anywhere in the world today. And so that's the challenge, I think. Another one of these challenges with regulators is they live inside a jurisdiction when technology does not. And they can apply rules within a particular box when technology doesn't live inside that box. And so all of a sudden, you'll just see it kind of sneak around not to get, like, I'd say that the vast majority of people that I know building companies in this industry, of whom most of my network exists in this industry, are not out there trying to steal people's money and scam people. They're trying to build software companies and think about innovative ways to raise capital. And that they're being pressured into making decisions like, should I stay in Canada or should I not?
So let me pivot off of that to a question from Facebook about Facebook.
Can we address that really quickly? Because if you look at the token ICOs in the last year and a half, those that have followed regulatory frameworks and those who haven't, those who have followed regulatory frameworks have raised far, far less money. So the money coming in doesn't want to be known, doesn't want to be traced, and that raises alarm bells for me. And so when I hear companies talking about, let's change the regulation to make it easier for the money that's coming into my company to be basically untraceable, we should be concerned as a people.
So to the Facebook question and Cambridge and the Cambridge Analytics scandal, do you think this is making the case for decentralized currencies?
I wish it was. I mean, I think the biggest realization coming out of Facebook and Cambridge Analytica is that, in fact, most people haven't turned off their Facebook accounts. So, again, to Christian's earlier point, I think there's a lot of us who are willing to make that trade-off. Because it's such a normal part of our day-to-day lives. We've accepted that as status quo, that I get services, therefore I give something up. And in most contexts, if you're not paying for that service, it's because you're the product that is being sold to somebody else, right? Your data is the product.
But isn't that the fundamental argument against Bitcoin when it comes to money? People have made a deal with the financial system. Yeah, it's got some frictions, some inconveniences, but it kind of works.
But this is, I think I fundamentally agree with Christian on this point that if we can't get these systems to a point where they're significantly more accessible and more efficient, I don't think they will hit the mainstream. I don't think most people will be willing to go through the layers and layers of obstacles and frictions that currently exist to interact with crypto, and not just as a currency, but as a technology. And if that's what the industry should be focusing on right now. I think the best projects out there. And I say this with a bias, are those focused on infrastructure, not those focused on next generation applications, because I think those applications, to Hilary's point, are like building Netflix in 1993, and I think it's significantly too early to start thinking about those things. I think we've got to start worrying about what are the fiber optic cables that need to get built in crypto before we can start thinking about that.
So, and I would say I'd be worried that we haven't seen the killer app yet. Right, the internet protocol would not be here today. We wouldn't have the internet today if we didn't have email. I know, and I'm sure a lot of us would all wish email would change or update. But the reality is, a lot of that infrastructure was built because money was being spent. There was real money to be made. And I think without the killer app, I think there's a very real chance that blockchain, the space as a whole, sort of dies on the vine. And that happens in tech all the time. I mean, there's plenty of examples out there of really interesting tech that never went anywhere.
So we've got a player's question here on whether Ether's value will climb as high as Bitcoin has in the past 6 months. Anyone want to take that on?
Well, I mean, I'm not to make a prediction on the price, but there is, it's worth understanding that they have very significantly different monetary supplies and monetary policies built into the Ethereum protocol versus Bitcoin. One is very, very restricted and deflationary in its supply, has led to high prices. The other is significantly more supply of it and is inflationary in its design. So I don't think anytime soon we're going to see Ethereum be at the same value per coin as Bitcoin. We'll see.
Any Ethereum boosters here?
Oh, this is not a hit on Ethereum.
Yeah.
Just
I'm bullish on it. I can't say whether it's going to match Bitcoin or exceed the price of Bitcoin per coin. We are studying the applications that are being built on Ethereum, and I think that's why I'm bullish on Ethereum as a technology. And full disclosure, I own Ether, so you can take my comments for what they're worth. But we are doing deep research in this area and looking at enterprise experimentation and other experiments which are taking place on the platform. So I'm interested to see where it goes.
We had another audience question here about the energy burden of blockchain generally, but cryptocurrency specifically uses a lot of energy, all the mining going on, and lots of projections about how it would drain the world's energy production if it went to scale. How serious a concern is this for you, Matt, as you're building things out, and Hilary, as you kind of scan the world? Is this just an interesting intellectual debate, or is it becoming a practical challenge?
I think it's more an interesting intellectual debate. I think the last time I heard kind of an analogy, I think Bitcoin uses something like the energy on a daily basis of Australia as a country. So it's not insignificant. I do think that there's a more fundamental question that the cryptocurrency industry needs to be asking is what happens as the cost of energy drops to near zero over the course of the next few decades, and that I think is a more important trend for us to be focusing on as people building infrastructure in cryptocurrency is the cost, the barrier to entry. The reason Bitcoin is secure is because it's prohibitively expensive to mine Bitcoin, and it's almost a security feature. If it becomes less prohibitively expensive to mine Bitcoin, then potentially the security of that system starts to dissipate over time.
So you think the cost of energy is going to zero?
Well, I think the cost of energy trends on the cost of production of solar and the cost of production of alternative energy sources is on a decreasing trend. And so maybe, living in Ontario, we're probably the one place in the world who doesn't recognize that.
I think our trend's going the other way.
Yeah. We'll see. Maybe not after next month.
It begs an interesting question. I don't necessarily agree with the trend of zero, but let's assume at least a baseline price globally for energy, and it's not particularly high. But in theory, as all of these coins mature, the lowest cost mining provider will end up becoming the last one standing, or potentially last one standing, which defeats the whole purpose of the distributed nature of it. Right? We've seen this in we've seen this in content delivery networks on the internet, right? So the idea originally was, everyone was going to host their own web servers, and it's going to be it was going to be massive distributed. But the web today actually looks extremely concentrated. We have these CDNs, these content delivery networks. The web is far more concentrated today. Why? Cost and speed, right? We have a cost and speed advantage to being centralized internet today. I see the same thing happening within the blockchain, the distributed ledger space, and I think that's actually an existential threat to the space.
Right.
I agree.
So as we move towards close, I wonder if you could each share some insights as to what large organizations, large enterprises should be thinking about. What questions should we be asking and exploring, not just RBC, but everyone involved in established organizations. Matt, maybe I can start with you.
I think one of the challenges that needs to be considered in strategies long term, if this technology continues to move on this trend, is that many of us building, and I used to work at Deloitte, we went through this. This is where I started my career in the blockchain space, was thinking about what were the challenges of blockchains as it related to us as a firm. Many of the moats we've built around our industries and around our companies are based on the barrier to entry of very, very expensive infrastructure that allows us to be a Big Five bank in Canada, allows us to be a major insurance provider, allows us to be, something that is extremely, prohibitively expensive for somebody to come in and compete in your industry. If this technology promises anything, it promises to create open, public, free infrastructure on top of which businesses can be built at little to no cost of infrastructure. And that means that we can start to build competitive products to what banks have provided for centuries without the cost of infrastructure of banks. And if that trend is true, then strategic decisions need to be made within these large enterprises.
Hilary, what questions should we be asking?
As organizations, I think it's incumbent upon business leaders to learn about potential transformation of this technology and to become informed. Find out how your existing business model could be transformed by new technology. In the same way that the internet radically transformed business models, in what way could blockchain architecture, could cryptocurrencies pose a threat to existing business? How do you prepare? Do you wait? Do you experiment? One of the functions, our role at the BRI, is to help organizations prepare for what we see as an inevitable transformation, and to help steer their organizations strategically for the future. How will, what applications are being built? Essentially, if you're Blockbuster today, what are the Netflixes of tomorrow? And Blockbuster didn't have the data, they did not have the business cycles to make the decision to buy Netflix, and so they didn't. And we know how that story ended. And our purpose is to help organizations learn about what governments are doing with this technology, what businesses are doing, and what innovators are doing to create alternative systems. So get informed.
Christian, what should we be thinking about? Maybe what should we avoid thinking about?
Yeah, no, look, I think I would advise companies to ask hard questions, peel back the layer of jargon and actually ask themselves, like, what actually is this, what is the application that we would use this for? Is it actually useful? Do a cost-benefit analysis of at scale. It's, these projects are very easy, and they lull you into a sense of security that this stuff will just work at scale, but actually ask questions of how does this actually work at scale? And then ask yourself, are there easier, faster, cheaper ways of doing something for your end consumer? And I don't see enough of that questioning going on. I see a lot of the I see a lot of the large companies going, oh, we're going to do investigative blockchain work simply because, which is fine. I think that's not a smart thing to do. But going beyond that, they need to start asking really hard questions.
Great. So we started the conversation with some provocative comments about how no one knows what they're talking about in this space, and I think you've helped elevate all of our thinking around this issue. So thank you for sharing the time with us today and sharing your insights. And before we go, I'd like to mention that as a token of our appreciation, a donation is being made to the charities of your choice. So for Matthew, it's Thorn, Hilary, it's the Tim Hortons Children's Foundation, and Christian has picked the Sick Kids Foundation. I wonder if you could just say a few words about why that charity means so much to you.
Yeah.
Matthew.
Thorn has been trying to address the problem of online children's sex slavery and trafficking of online content, and they're increasingly starting to notice that cryptocurrencies are seeping into that world, and it's, I think, a problem that needs to be addressed, and we're hopefully going to help them find some solutions to that.
That's great, thank you. Hilary. Tim Hortons.
Tim Hortons Children's Foundation sends underprivileged children to camp. And our family had the experience of meeting 4 of these girls who had never left the city and who found the experience of being in Ontario, the lakes and trees of Northern Ontario, to be such a transformational, peaceful break from the chaos and the conflict of their daily lives. But secondly, summer camp is one of the only opportunities that young people have to digitally disconnect and to develop their emotional intelligence and learn how to play with each other and to create and to experience things in an unplugged, disconnected environment. So if we can continue to nurture the way we interact through a camp environment, I think that's a service to our young people. Thank you.
No, thank you. Christian, Sick Kids.
Sick Kids, what can I say about Sick Kids? The research that's done at Sick Kids is saving lives, not just here in Toronto, in fact, not just nationwide, but globally. We have very few institutions in Canada in any sector that are recognized globally, and Sick Kids is one of them. And so we are so lucky as Torontonians, Ontarians, and Canadians to have such an amazing group of people working into transformational research, which is transforming into saving not just kids' lives, but in fact sometimes adults' lives. So I'm very proud to be a supporter, and in fact RBC is as well. So thanks to RBC as well for being a big supporter of Sick Kids.
No, and thanks for your leadership. You're chairing the board, right, of the Sick Kids Foundation.
Vice chair of the board.
Vice chair, sorry, but terrific the leadership you're doing there and all that it's doing. All the charities are doing. Please mark your calendars. May 24th is our next RBC Disruptors. We're going to be broadcasting from the C2 conference in Montreal with the Chief Digital Officer of Estonia, talking about how to create a digital state. So some of these issues and more. In June, we've got Dax Da Silva coming to talk about diversity and innovation to mark Pride Month. And then in July, we'll be holding our annual How to Think Like a Startup with some cool firms from the Valley joining us here. So follow us on RBC Connect for details. If you want to listen or share this conversation, we'll have a podcast recording posted shortly. Sign up for our mailing list and follow us on SoundCloud and iTunes. Thanks so much for spending this morning with us. Matt, Hilary, Christian, thank you for your time.